Welcome back to Reddit Tales by Uncle Sammy. I see you, I appreciate you, and I'm thankful you subscribe and keep showing up. This space is built on your insights. Leave your thoughts and lessons below. Now, cue the tension, cue the truth, let's get into it. There is a particular kind of disrespect that hides behind sophistication. It sounds polished, educated, even cultured, so you talk yourself out of calling it what it is. In this story, the lesson is simple. When somebody keeps correcting you, shrinking you, or translating you in front of their family, do not mistake that for refinement. That is rehearsal for control. The moment you feel yourself performing just to be accepted, stop and ask whether you're being welcomed or evaluated. Before we get into this relationship drama revenge story, tell me this in the comments. If your partner let their family disrespect you at dinner, would you walk out immediately or stay quiet and watch? Like, share and subscribe for more original relationship stories about betrayal, family pressure, and quiet revenge that hits harder than yelling ever could. The night Sabine Devereux told me I was finally meeting her parents, I stood in my kitchen in Baltimore ironing the same white shirt 3 times. My row house radiator hissed like it had an opinion. Rain tapped the back window over the sink, and on the counter beside me sat a bourbon pecan pie from a bakery near Lexington Market, still warm enough to fog the box. We had been together for 16 months. Long enough for toothbrushes at each other's places. Long enough for quiet Sunday mornings. Long enough that I had already been talking to a jeweler in Mount Vernon about a ring I had no business buying if I was still guessing. Sabine said her parents were particular, which was one of her favorite words. She used it for wine glasses, fonts, airport pickups, and people who chewed too loudly. She was 32, sharp as a paper edge, the kind of woman who could walk into a room with bare walls and immediately start rearranging the air. She worked in Washington, D.C., branding luxury events for hotels that smelled like cedar and lemon oil. She corrected menus in restaurants under her breath. She folded paper napkins into neat rectangles before eating. When she was anxious, she rolled the rings on her fingers around and around like she was tuning herself. I was 35 and worked as a senior credit analyst for a community bank downtown, the kind of place that financed barbershops, daycares, churches, carryouts, and family businesses that bigger banks barely looked at. I liked numbers because they told the truth eventually. At night, I restored old tabletop radios on my kitchen table under a gooseneck lamp, brushing dust from tubes and waiting for static to turn into music. Sabine called that hobby charming, in the way people call a thing charming, when they do not understand why it matters. I had learned patience from circuits, and from my grandmother Evie, who had taught me more than she knew. My grandmother was from Opelousas, Louisiana, and when I was a boy she would sit me at her yellow Formica table with chicory coffee. She let me sweeten too much and speak French to me until my ears adjusted. Nothing fancy. Church French, kitchen French, family French. She used it to tell stories, to recite prayers, to complain about people who overstayed. Later I took classes in college and polished what she gave me. I almost never mentioned it, because there was rarely a reason. It lived in me the way a childhood hymn lives in you, ready when called. Sabine knew I had family in Louisiana. She did not know what else came with that. She arrived that Saturday in a silver coat and impatience. Not the brown shoes, she said before she kissed me. Were the black pair. My mother notices shoes. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She was not. On the drive down to Prince George's County, she kept adjusting things. My collar, the way I held the pie box, the volume of my voice when I asked whether traffic would thin after Laurel. Please do not tell the story about the repossessed church van, she said. My father respects seriousness. I told myself she was nervous. I told myself people got strange around their families and returned to themselves later. Her parents lived in a large brick colonial at the end of a cul-de-sac where every lawn looked disciplined. Porch lamps glowed amber through a fine cold mist. There was a bronze knocker on the front door shaped like a lion's head, and when Rochelle Devereux opened it, warm air rolled out carrying thyme, butter, and furniture polish. She was beautiful in a composed, deliberate way, with silver at her temples and a silk blouse the color of deep water. Her handshake was brief. Her eyes moved over me once, not rudely, just thoroughly. Behind her, framed photos lined the hallway. graduations, galas, church anniversaries, a family that had spent years practicing stillness. Milton Devereux met me in the study with jazz low on a turntable and 2 fingers of bourbon in each glass. He had the voice of a man used to being listened to without repeating himself. He asked where I grew up, what my parents did, how long I planned to stay in banking, and whether I intended to remain in analysis or move into leadership. Those were his exact words. I answered as plainly as I knew how. West Baltimore. My mother worked 30 years at the post office. My father drove MTA buses until his knees gave him trouble. I managed portfolios informally already, I said. He nodded, but in that room a nod felt less like approval than notation. Dinner was in a formal dining room with a chandelier that made the silverware look colder than silverware should. Rochelle had set out linen napkins through brass rings, and her cobalt blue gumbo pot sat on a trivet in the center, like a family heirloom. There was roasted chicken with lemon, butter beans, collards with smoked turkey, and skillet cornbread that smelled so good it nearly relaxed me. Sabine sat straight back across from me in a cream sweater and small gold hoops, every inch of her arranged. At first it was ordinary enough. They asked about my work, my church, the old radios. Sabine smiled at the polished version of me she had apparently submitted. The first switch happened lightly. Rochelle asked Sabine in French to pass the hot sauce. Sabine answered in French without looking at me. I barely reacted because families do what they do, and I had no reason yet to hear threats in it. Milton joined with a comment about the weather. Sabine laughed. Then Rochelle's eyes flicked to me and back to her daughter. "Il est fiable," she said. "He looks reliable. Not cruel on its face. Just cool." Appraising. Sabine answered, "Oui, au moins, ca." Yes, at least that. She reached for her water, as if they had discussed table salt. I set my fork down very carefully. Sometimes when you understand a language people think you cannot, the first feeling is not anger. It is confusing. Your mind searches for alternative meanings, kinder translations, any possibility that you heard wrong. Milton asked me in English whether I followed baseball. Then to Sabine in French. He has no edge, but perhaps that calms you. Sabine gave a small shrug. He is restful. Restful, not kind, not intelligent, not funny. Restful like a hotel lobby lamp. I tasted metal under my tongue. The room stayed warm, the food stayed good, and something under my ribs went hard. I looked at Sabine then, really looked. There was no strain on her face, no guilty flinch, no private signal that this was a performance for difficult parents. She was comfortable, worse than comfortable. She was fluent in it. Rochelle asked in English if I wanted more collards, and before I answered she turned to her daughter again. "Et l'autre?" she said in French. "The attorney?" Sabine dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin. "Adrian was too visible," she said. "Too much appetite." Milton chuckled. "And this one—" Sabine looked at me and smiled the same smile she used in hotel lobbies. "This one stays where you put him." That was the moment I almost stood up. I could feel the exact shape of it in my legs. I could have said, in clean measured French, that I was sitting right there, and that none of them were as subtle as they imagined. I did not. I stayed seated for 2 reasons, and I know them clearly even now. First, my mother taught me that some confrontations cost you more because of where you have them. Second, I needed to be sure. The truth was ugly enough already. I was not going to let them turn it into me being emotional, mistaken, or rude in their house. So I stayed and listened. Once I stayed, they got bolder. That is what contempt does when it feels safe. Milton asked me in English about community banking and whether defaults were rising. While I answered, Rochelle said softly in French, "His hands are nice. He works." Sabine said, "Yes, and he always shows up." Milton replied, "A dependable man can be useful during a demanding season." Useful, demanding season. They were discussing my place in her life like they were choosing a rug that would survive winter. I kept my face still and broke my cornbread into equal pieces because my fingers needed some task other than tightening around the fork. The worst part was not Milton and Rochelle. It was Sabine's ease. I could have forgiven family arrogance before I could forgive intimacy used as camouflage. They mentioned Adrian again, the former fiancé I knew about only in broad strokes. Corporate law, expensive watches. The kind of man Sabine described once as all motion. Rochelle asked whether she missed that level of ambition. Sabine stirred her water and said, "Ambition is loud up close." I wanted quiet. Milton answered, "Quiet is not the same as depth." Sabine's mouth twitched. "I know." Then she looked up and asked me, in English, whether my mother's sweet potato pie recipe used nutmeg. At some point, Rochelle brought out salad plates for dessert, and the pecan pie I had carried in suddenly looked foolish, like a child's contribution to adults. She thanked me for it with exact politeness. Milton told a story in English about commuting into the city in the 80s, then turned to French again when I complimented the gumbo. "At least he recognizes good food," he said. Sabine laughed, low and brief. "That is because he was raised with ordinary things." I still remember the sound of the chandelier crystals when the heat kicked on. Tiny clicks over my head while they reduced my whole life to something serviceable and small. Shame is a strange thing. It does not always arrive as humiliation. Sometimes it comes dressed as self-investigation. Sitting there, I began revising myself in real time. Was my suit too plain? Had I spoken too softly in the study? Had I made the wrong joke in the hallway when Milton asked if I followed football? Did I say ma'am too much? The brain gets busy when the heart is cornered. I even found myself trying to earn back dignity from people who had already shown me they had no interest in giving it. That embarrassed me more than their French ever could. I hated my own need at that moment. The mocking never became dramatic. That is part of what made it cruel. It stayed elegant all night. Small cuts, a correction here, a comparison there, an assumption that my silence meant ignorance. Rochelle asked whether I attended the symphony. Sabine answered for me in English. He likes simpler places. That was not true. I liked whatever moved me. In French, Milton said, "Do not overtrain him." Rochelle answered, "I am not building one." Sabine smoothed her napkin flat beside her plate. "No, he is for peace." She said it almost tenderly, and that tenderness made my stomach turn harder than the rest. When we left, the mist had become a real rain. Sabine tucked herself into the passenger seat, kicked off her heels, and exhaled like a woman relieved after a successful performance. "That went better than I expected," she said. My hand stayed at 10 and 2 on the wheel. The wipers beat a nervous rhythm across the glass. "Did it?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "My father did not interrogate you to death, and my mother liked your pie." I waited. I gave her a full minute of wet road and dashboard glow to choose honesty. She never reached for it. "You were a little stiff," she said finally, "but nothing I cannot work with." I nearly laughed then because it was so naked. Work with, as if I were a presentation draft, as if she had just finished reviewing a venue proposal. I could have confronted her right there on the Beltway, could have pulled into a gas station and ended it under fluorescent lights while someone mopped around the coffee station. I did not, and that was my second choice point, one I have judged myself for. I stayed quiet because I wanted to see what love looked like once disguise was no longer available to me. I wanted to know whether the dinner had been an exception or simply the first honest room I had entered. The next week I rode the train into Baltimore with their words packed in my chest like wet cloth. Penn Station smelled like coffee, Old Stone, and wool coach drying. A bus sighed at the curb outside. A man in a knit cap was arguing softly into his phone near the newsstand. Everything ordinary looked sharpened. At work, I reviewed a daycare expansion loan and caught myself staring at a row of projected numbers without reading them. Restful, useful, for peace. The phrases are replayed with perfect pronunciation. I had restored enough radios to know when static was not in the room, but in the wiring behind the wall. Once I knew, other moments rearranged themselves. Sabine correcting the way I pronounced a sommelier's name when I had said it was fine. Sabine told her friends at brunch that I was not really into art because I did not like one museum exhibit she loved. Sabine laughed when I said I might mentor junior analysts and told me, "You are so good where you are." I had mistaken those moments for habits of tone, the rough edges of a high-performing woman under stress. Now they snapped together into a picture I had been standing too close to see. Some people do not date you. They edit you for private use. Sabine called that Wednesday with her usual clipped energy. She wanted to come by her apartment in Navy Yard and look over revised numbers for a studio she planned to launch. Part branding, part intimate events, part consulting for boutique hotels. I had already spent 2 weekends helping her untangle vendor costs and write realistic cash flow assumptions. I said I had work. She was silent for a beat too long. You always have work, she said. That is one of your core settings. I looked out my office window on a gray afternoon over downtown and thought, there it is again. Me, reduced the setting. That night, I opened the cedar box where I kept a ring estimate from the jeweler, a train ticket stub from our first trip to Philadelphia, and one of my grandmother's recipe cards written in slanted blue ink. On the back of the card, she had written a line in French years ago when I left for college. Respect yourself before you ask anyone else to. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called the jeweler and told him to stop. Not cancel entirely, just stop. Hold the design. I could hear his pencil pause on paper. Everything all right? He asked. Not enough, I said. You would think clarity would make action easy. It does not. Clarity often arrives before courage and waits around irritating you. I still went to Sabine's apartment that Friday because a part of me wanted the version of us that existed before the Devereux dining room to come walking back through the door. Her place smelled like bergamot candles and expensive hand soap. She had mood boards spread across the dining table. Finally, she said when I stepped in, I need your banker brain. That phrase settled on me heavily. Not my judgment, not my care, not even my honesty. My banker brain, a tool she could pull down from a shelf. I chose not to confront her then either, and I know exactly why. If I had said, right there in that clean apartment with the city lights behind her, I understood every word your family said, she would have cried. Sabine did not cry often, but when she did, people around her forgot the original problem and started tending to her feelings like an emergency. I was not willing to become the comforter in my own humiliation. So I did something colder and, for me, harder. I disengaged in increments. I gave generic comments on her projections. I stopped building her formulas. I took my spare key back when she was in the shower. Distance changed our conversations almost immediately. You feel odd, she said over dinner one night at a small place near Easter Market where the butter beans tasted like smoke and pepper. Odd how? I asked. She rolled a ring around her finger and looked at me too carefully. Not available. I wanted to say, available for what? To be translated? To be resized? Instead, I said, I have been busy. She leaned back. You disappear when I need structure. I almost admired the sentence. It moved all the furniture around so she could become the deprived one. Maybe I am tired of being your structure, I said. Her fork stopped halfway up. The holiday season puts pressure on everything. The bank was swamped with end-of-year renewals. Church calendars filled with concerts and toy drives. Every block in my neighborhood seemed to smell like cinnamon or fryer grease. Sabine, meanwhile, got more aggressive about her studio. Her mother's etiquette workshops had outgrown the space above the florist in Bowie, and now Sabine wanted to combine Rochelle's brand with her own into a polished event and training space in D.C. It is elegant, multi-generational, culturally specific, she said one night, pacing her kitchen. It will print money if the financing is disciplined. Then she stopped, which is where you come in. There it was plain at last. She wanted more than approval from me. She wanted access. I asked who else was involved. My parents, obviously, she said, and my brother is helping with lease negotiations. I kept my face neutral. You should work with someone outside the family, I said. She frowned. That is what you are. I almost smiled at the cruelty of that accident. Outside the family. Close enough to use. Far enough to mock. I am not the right person for this, I said. Sabine stared at me as if I had answered a simple question in the wrong language. Do not be difficult, Kendrick. Difficult. The man at dinner had been restful. Now it is difficult. She invited me to lunch with her parents the following Sunday after church. As if the first dinner had been such a success, we were naturally building tradition. I went, not because I wanted to, but because avoidance had started to feel too much like permission. We met at a restaurant in Largo with white tablecloths, trying hard to be grand. Rochelle wore a camel coat and offered me a smile several degrees warmer than before. Milton asked about the bank and whether small business lending would tighten in the new year. Sabine touched my wrist when she laughed. They were performing now, and once I saw it as performance, it looked flimsy. I made a decision the next morning at work. It was not dramatic, and that is exactly why it mattered. I walked into my director's office, closed the door, and disclosed a personal conflict involving a prospective borrower tied to someone I was dating. I asked to be recused from any review, informal guidance, or internal recommendation connected to Sabine, Rochelle, Milton, or any company they controlled. My director, a patient woman named Denise who had seen half the city try to mix romance with lending, listened without prying. "Good boundary," she said. "Send me the names in writing." I did. That email was the cleanest revenge I have ever taken. Let me be precise about that, because people hear the word revenge and imagine sabotage. I did not tank their file. I never touched it. I did not whisper in hallways or plant doubts in committee meetings or make a single phone call meant to harm them. I simply removed the advantage they assumed was theirs. Sabine had spent months treating my steadiness like furniture. The Devereux family thought they could diminish me in private and still benefit from my labor in public. My revenge was refusing to carry them 1 inch further. It sounds small until you understand how many polished people have built entire lives on borrowed effort from those they quietly disrespect. Sabine sent me her deck anyway. 46 slides. Beige branding, gold accents, language about legacy and curation. Her revenue assumptions were inflated, her occupancy projections were fantasy, and her expense line for staffing was insultingly low. In earlier months, I would have rebuilt the whole thing in 2 nights and left comments clear enough to save her from embarrassment. This time I replied with 3 bland sentences. Review your assumptions, tighten fixed costs. Consult counsel on lease exposure. She called immediately. "That is all?" she asked. "That is what I have," I said. "You used to be more generous." I looked at a half-restored Zenith radio on my table. "You used to be kinder," I said, and hung up. For a week she oscillated between icy and sweet. Good morning texts with no warmth. Then late-night messages saying she missed the version of us that felt aligned. That was her language when she wanted accountability, without naming an offense. I did not bite. One evening after choir rehearsal at my church, while people stacked folding chairs and somebody's little boy chased a cough drop on the pews, I sat in my car and admitted the truth I had been avoiding. I was not staying because I loved her too much to leave. I was staying because I hated the idea that I had offered something sacred to a woman who found it merely convenient. In February, Sabine invited me to a tasting at a converted carriage house in Northeast D.C. It was for potential investors, partners, and a few friends who could make the venture look respectable. "Please come," she said, voice low and measured. "I need us to look normal." That sentence should have ended the conversation by itself. Instead, I said yes because I had grown tired of half-truths and partial exits. I wanted one clean ending, not a slow leak. I also suspected her parents would be there, and I wanted them all in the same room when I finally put the mask down. Not for spectacle, for accuracy. The carriage house had exposed brick, hanging greenery, candles in hurricane glass, and servers drifting through with crab toast points and tiny spoons of shrimp and grits. The room smelled like rosemary and money. Sabine wore a forest green dress and the expression she saved for donors, all warm with calculations behind it. Rochelle greeted guests near a display board about modern etiquette for executive spaces. Milton held court by the bar in a navy suit and gold cufflinks. When he saw me, his smile carried something like relief. That told me enough already. They still thought I was part of the infrastructure. They had no idea the floor had been removed months ago. For the first half hour I watched. That was always my talent. Sabine introduced me to 2 hotel managers as my partner in finance and in life, which almost made me laugh. Her mother praised my discipline. Her father said steady men were rare. Then, near the small dessert table where somebody had arranged miniature lemon tarts with edible flowers, I heard Rochelle murmur in French to Milton, "As long as he stands near the lending people, the room relaxes." Milton answered, "He makes the venture look grounded." Sabine joined them and said, "After tonight, I can manage the rest." Manage. Grounded. Again they reduced me to function, forgetting language has memory. I stepped closer, picked up a tart, and answered Rochelle in French, so cleanly she nearly dropped her glass. "You never needed to simplify around me," I said. I understood the dinner in October, the lunch in December, and this conversation just now. Their faces changed in sequence. First confusion, then calculation, then the smaller, uglier thing underneath. Sabine went pale in a way I had never seen on her. Milton straightened. Rochelle's mouth parted, then closed. Around us, guests kept mingling, unaware. That was the beauty of it. No shouting, no spectacle. Just truth entering the room at its natural volume and making all their elegance look suddenly cheap. Sabine touched my arm. "Come with me," she whispered. "Now." We stepped into a side hallway near the restrooms where the brick gave way to plaster and the sounds of the event dulled. For a second she just stared. "How much did you understand?" she asked. I looked at her and felt something sadder than anger. Enough to know I was a season, a tool, a calming prop, and the safe man you thought would stay where you put him. She pressed her palm to her forehead. "You should have said something." I almost smiled. "At your parents' table? So you could call me dramatic in 2 languages." She did cry then, right on schedule, but I was ready for it. "It was complicated," she said. "My family talks like that. They talk in shorthand. They are critical with everyone." I shook my head. "No, criticism is honest and maybe harsh." That was contempt. She tried another angle. I was trying to keep peace. "By joining them?" I asked. "By translating me into something smaller." She covered her mouth for a second, then said the only true thing she had said all night. "I did not think you would ever know." That landed cleaner than any apology could have. There is a freedom in hearing the truth from the person who benefited from your ignorance. I took a small envelope from my coat pocket and handed it to her. Inside was a spare key to my place, the photo strip from our first date, and the printed jeweler's sketch of a ring she was never going to wear. I had folded that sketch once down the middle, then flattened it back out. "I was going to ask you to marry me in December," I said. Her eyes widened with an almost childish shock, which angered me more than tears had. "Do not," I said quietly when she reached for my hand. "Please do not turn this into a tragedy about timing. This is about character." Milton found us before she could answer. He must have seen enough in our faces to understand the broad outline. "What is going on?" he asked. I switched back to English because some things deserve witnesses. "I am ending this," I said. "And for the record, I recuse myself from anything involving your family's financing weeks ago. I have not interfered. I have simply stepped out." His jaw tightened. That was unnecessary. "No," I said. "Mocking a man in a language you think he does not know and then expecting professional help is unnecessary." What I did was clean. Rochelle stood at the hallway entrance, silent, finally unable to manage the room. I left before the event ended. Outside, February air slapped the heat from my face. Traffic on Florida Avenue moved in impatient bursts, headlights sliding over wet pavement. My phone started buzzing before I reached my car. Sabine once, then again, then a text from Rochelle, "We should speak privately." Then Milton, "This is unfortunate and emotional." I laughed at that one, sitting behind the wheel in a dark parking lot. Emotional, the old trick. Make the injury secondary to the reaction. I put the phone face down, rested my head against the seat, and let myself grieve the right thing at last. Not Sabine, not the future I had imagined, my own refusal to see. The weeks after were quieter than I expected. No screaming fallout, no dramatic social media nonsense. Just the administrative sadness of untangling a life before it fully merged. I mailed back the sweater she had left at my place. She sent a box of books and one of my cuff links. I switched my gym. I stopped taking the exit toward her apartment without thinking. At work, Denise told me the Dever-related application had moved elsewhere and that it was not especially strong on fundamentals. That was all she said, and all I wanted to know. Their trouble, if trouble came, belonged to the numbers they had chosen, not to me. Spring in Baltimore arrived slowly, with dirty snow giving way to rain-slicked brick. Then daffodils by church steps and old men reclaiming the benches outside the corner store. I spent more evenings at my kitchen table with radios. There is comfort in honest repair. A broken capacitor is broken. A loose wire is loose. No one cries and tells you the circuit was only being complicated. On Saturdays, I got my hair cut on North Avenue, listened to men argue about the Orioles, and answered, "Nah, not really," when they asked whether I was seeing anybody. Some grief is easy to carry in places where nobody expects a polished explanation. I also started therapy, which I say without embarrassment because humiliation can leave roots behind if you do not pull them. My therapist asked why I had stayed through so many smaller signs before the dinner. I told her the truth. Sabine admired things my neighborhood and my upbringing had not always taught me to admire myself. Order, refinement, precision in public. I like being chosen by a woman who moved through expensive rooms without apology. Somewhere in there, I confuse her approval with my growth. Real growth does not require self-erasure. That was a hard sentence to earn. Harder, maybe, than leaving her after the French ever was. Sabine came to see me once, in May, on a Saturday afternoon, while I was re-shellacking the wood case of a 1940s Emerson radio. I almost did not open the door, but I was tired being haunted by possibilities. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, just stripped of arrangement. "I was wrong," she said before I could speak. "Not just at dinner. In this way, I use you to feel steady while I perform for my parents." That was closer to accountability than anything she had offered before. I let her say it. Then I said, "I believe you mean that now. I also believe you meant the other thing then." She stood in my doorway with spring pollen collecting on the shoulders of her black coat and asked whether there was any way back. I thought of the dining room chandelier, the cobalt blue gumbo pot, the little click of crystals when the heat came on. I thought of the hallway at the carriage house and the look on her face when I handed her the ring sketch. "No," I said, "because I would never stop wondering when you were translating me downward in your head." She flinched, but she nodded. "That is fair," she said. "It was the most respectful exchange we ever had, and it happened after we were already over." Later that summer, I heard through a mutual friend that Sabine's studio had downsized before launch. The lease terms were too aggressive. Build-out costs rose. Investors got cautious. Rochelle kept her workshops above the florist. None of that gave me joy. Exactly. Satisfaction is not always smiling. Sometimes it is simply seeing cause and effect restored to the universe. Meanwhile, I was promoted to portfolio manager and given a cluster of neighborhood development accounts I had wanted for years. Denise told me I had a reputation for judgment and clean boundaries. I thanked her and thought about how expensive that lesson had been. Some promotions are paid in dignity first. I still use French, though maybe differently now. When I visit my aunt in Louisiana, we sit on her porch and speak the language the way my grandmother did, not to hide a knife in it, but to remember who belonged to us before money and posture got involved. That matters to me. I refuse to let one family's vanity steal a whole inheritance. Sometimes when I am tuning a radio and the signal snaps into place, I think about Sabine saying I was restful, and I almost forgive the insult for accidentally pointing towards something true. Peace is not weakness. Steadiness is not small. Quiet is not emptiness. What I learned is that revenge does not always look like ruin. Sometimes it looks like withholding your labor from people who assumed they were entitled to it. Sometimes it looks like one sentence spoken at the right moment in the language they use to diminish you. Sometimes it looks like mailing back a sweater, recusing yourself cleanly, and choosing not to spend another year explaining your own worth. They thought I was the kind of man who would stay where he was put. They were wrong. I moved myself. I kept my name intact. And the first honest thing I built after that was a life nobody could translate smaller. The part of this story that stays with me is not the French. It is the pattern around it. The corrected shoes in the car, the banker brain on demand, the way Sabine said she needed them to look normal, and the quiet email where Kendrick recused himself instead of playing savior. That is what boundaries often look like in real life. Not a dramatic speech. Just a clean refusal to keep financing disrespect with your time, skill, and silence. If the story got under your skin, comment self-respect below. Like this video. Share it with someone who has ever been underestimated. And subscribe for more original first-person relationship drama, family betrayal stories, breakup revenge stories, and hard-earned endings where dignity matters more than getting the last word. The end.